The Rage Spell. One of many spells on the Clash Royale roster that in my opinion has one of the craziest journeys in Clash Royale history. Nowadays, it may not seem that different from other cheap spells, but it's gone through a lot to get into the position it's in today. Although fundamentally Rage doesn't seem to be too disliked, this certainly wasn't always the case. With the way it was a few years ago, it was assumed by many this card would never be in a healthy position. It didn't have a lot of development in the early years of Clash Royale, but with the reworks and surges it's had in recent years, I just had to make a video covering it. So today we're going to go over the entire history of the Rage spell, cover the balance changes it's received, look at the decks it's thrived in, and see how it ended up in the position it's in today. Rage Spell was released all the way back on January 4th, 2016, the day of Clash Royale's beta launch as one of the OG 42 cards. This card was of epic rarity, indicating it was more special than most cards, and this was certainly true. This was the only spell that wouldn't have any direct effect on enemy units. Instead, this card would be used on your own troops to make them move and attack faster, specifically by 35%. This spell actually originated from Clash of Clans, but had some notable differences. The Clash of Clans Rage increased troops' damage, did not affect units' attack speed, and movement speed increased with level. This created a problem in Clash Royale because not only did it not affect the health or damage of other troops, but it did not have its own health or damage stat. The reason this is notable is because in Clash Royale, leveling up cards is supposed to change those two stats only. So without them, what would leveling up a Rage actually do? Well, unlike Clash of Clans, Rage's duration would increase with level. At level 1, a Rage spell would last for 10 seconds, and this would increase by 0.6 of a second for every additional level for a max of 14.2 seconds. Because of this, even if all cards were at the same level, it could lead to some very different interactions whether they were at level 1 or max. Only one other card had their duration increased with each level, and as time would make clear, this would make the card better at top level than in tournament play, even if all levels were equal, which is not how Clash Royale is supposed to work. So fundamentally, leveling up this card was more important than it was for most cards. However, even 10 seconds was plenty of time for troops to do whatever they needed to do, so in real matches, a lot of the time Rage was on the field, it would simply stay there, not providing value for its full duration. This meant effectively leveling up this card wasn't nearly as important as it was for most cards. It's a bit confusing, I know. For a spell that didn't do any damage, it was a pretty big commitment, costing 3 elixir, but aside from cost, sacrificing an entire deck slot for such a situational card was tough to justify. Rage wasn't really something that could be cycled through to get to more important cards because it was completely useless on its own, unlike something like Zap which could at least get some tower damage. To get adequate value out of it, you needed multiple friendly troops on the field at once, and that opportunity might only come up once or twice per battle. And it was never useful in a defensive situation unlike every other spell. It was less versatile than just about every other spell, which is why it's no surprise to see that Rage was one of 5 cards to not see any play in top 100 ladder at beta launch. Rage was a fun card in concept, but for the reasons I just explained, it wasn't viable for competitive play. It wasn't really a card that could turn the tide of the game. It was just to help you win a battle you were already winning quicker. The main thing you were seeing it in was spawner decks. If you could stack up lots of spawners and cover a bunch of them with the Rage spell, they would spawn extra units, since the Rage also increased the spawn rate of cards, which is a third stat I didn't mention before. The only cards that had a spawn rate stat at launch were the 3 spawner buildings and Witch, but like the Rage, none of these were seen that often in competitive play, except for Tombstone, and spending 3 elixir for just a few extra skeletons was not even remotely worth it. Spawners were pretty hated, and considering Rage was boosting them in casual areas of the game, it's no surprise to see it absent from the first few sets of balance changes. It was seen as a pretty toxic card, and since the majority of players resided not in top ladder, making it viable in competitive play could make it a nightmare in casual play. But as time went on, spawner decks dwindled even in casual play, and a lot of the variants that still existed didn't have Rage at all. By mid-February, Rage was the one and only card that saw 0 use in top ladder. It was arguably the worst card in the game. There was never really a situation where it would provide 3 elixir worth of value. It was so hard to incorporate into decks, with no hope of finding a place until it was given direct help, so nearly 2 months after launch, Rage would appear in the balance changes for the first time. On February 29, 2016, Rage would finally receive some attention. This was a weird card, so it would be interesting to see how Supercell changed it. But to everyone's surprise, it would not be receiving a buff, it was receiving a nerf. Why would they nerf a card that literally nobody in top ladder was using? Well, you see, Rage worked a bit differently in the early days. For a troop to be raged, you'd think it'd have to be within the Rage's barriers, but that wasn't true. As long as the troop was within the rage at any point, it would stay raged until the rage spell was gone, even if it ran far outside the barriers. Now that would no longer be the case. Instead of remaining raged until the rage dissipated, troops would only remain raged 2 seconds after exiting. But why would they do this now? Well, it's important to note that up to this point, rage was the only spell that lingered in the arena, so there wasn't another spell a troop could exit. But on February 29th, that would change as the poison spell was introduced. Supercell explains it felt weird that a spell's effects could stick to troops far outside of its boundaries. If this lingering stick happened with poison, it would make it so much stronger and just feel even more unfair. Imagine hitting an enemy unit with your poison for just 1 tick, but it takes 10 full ticks of slowness and damage. That wouldn't feel right. Especially when this new one would affect enemy units instead of just your own. Rage was massive, so this wasn't a situation that would come up often with it, but it was something to think about with new lingering spells like this. Even though Rage didn't deserve a nerf with no compensation, it got it for consistency. Despite being in an objectively worse state, it didn't see a fall in usage after this went live. It just seems like Supercell didn't care about this card at all. It was a joke. It was so bad and fundamentally just didn't seem like a card that fit into Clash Royale. It really begs the question, why did they add this card in the first place? What was the initial vision? Why wouldn't they give it a chance to shine in competitive play? Things weren't looking great, but only a few weeks after this nerf, Rage would appear in the balance changes once again, this time receiving a rework. On March 23rd, Rage would increase affected troop speed by 40% instead of 35%, but its duration was decreased by 20%. This was 2 seconds at level 1 and 1/10 of a second additional for each additional level. This made it so leveling up a Rage only increased its duration by half a second rather than 6/10 of a second. This was really still a buff though, since the full duration of Rage wasn't utilized before. You really only needed a few seconds of it, unless you were using it to boost spawners. A 35% boost did not justify spending 3 elixirs, so hopefully this would work better. It was nice to see Rage finally getting some love, but it was clear pretty quickly that this change made no difference. The boost difference was barely noticeable and didn't fix the core issues with Rage. It was going to need a lot more than a small nudge to see some competitive play. Despite no change in performance, this would be the last change Rage received for a while. For the next few months, it would continue to be one of the least used cards. And if this card didn't seem low value enough, Supercell would somehow make it even less appealing, because on July 4th, they would add the Lumberjack, a troop that would drop a rage spell upon dying. Lumberjack, unlike the rage card, could be useful on defense and still run onto the opponent's side to be a decent offensive support. And it was only 4 elixir, 1 more elixir than the rage itself. It was much more versatile than rage, and even its weaknesses compared to it didn't feel like weaknesses. You really only needed the rage on offense, and you'd want to wait until you had a big pushdown to use it anyway, so you could just send in the Lumberjack in the front and it would have the same effect. Remember, rage was really big, so placement didn't have to be super precise. Lumberjack was something that helped on defense and had to be responded to. 2 major things the rage spell lacked. The fact it was only 1 more elixir than the rage made rage feel even more useless and more of a joke. It was only used in meme decks. It was one of those cards the opponent never expected, so it could be used to catch them off guard, but even in that aspect, cards like Freeze just worked better. The Lumberjack just seemed like a better implementation of the rage spell, and with that, you didn't need the spell itself. Also, now if Supercell wanted to give Rage any more changes, they would have to keep the Lumberjack in mind, which could be a future dilemma. Lucky for Rage Spell though, Supercell would give it another chance with another rework. On September 19th, it would appear in the balance changes once again for the first time in about 6 months, receiving another rework. In this set, Rage's boost percentage would go from 40 to 30%. Also, its duration would be decreased by exactly 2 seconds at every level, but its elixir cost would be reduced from 3 to 2 elixir. It just didn't make sense to have a 3 elixir spell drop from a 4 elixir troop, and 3 elixir was way too much of a commitment for a spell like this anyway. Again, the duration decrease wasn't a huge deal since it already lasted for such a long time, but the boost decrease was definitely significant. This was a nice buff overall for sure, but it wasn't certain if it would be enough considering how bad it was before this. Pretty quickly, it was apparent that still, even at 1 less elixir, Rage was not worth using competitively. Although it was certainly much stronger and seemed to become more used in casual areas of the game, even at 2 elixir, it was hard justifying a slot for a card that was really only useful when you had a lot of friendly troops together. So, less than 2 months later, on November 1st, it would be buffed. 30% just wasn't a great boost. It was less than how much an Ice Wizard slowed down troops by. It needed help, so it was increased back to 35%, what it was upon launch. This was actually a pretty small change. It would rarely lead to cards getting an extra hit than they would before, but a buff is a buff. For the rest of 2016, we wouldn't see Rage make any strides in the competitive scene, as to be expected by this point. This November 2016 buff would actually be the last change the card received for a long time, despite continuing to see no success in competitive play. Why would that be the case? Why would Supercell stop giving Rage changes when it still needed help? Well, to answer this, we need to look at two mischievous menaces. Elite Barbarians were a new card added in the same month as the Rage buff, and in December they would be significantly buffed. They were becoming very popular, quickly becoming one of the most used cards, and likewise, most hated cards. The main thing that made them so obnoxious was their movement speed. They moved at a very fast movement speed, unlike most troops. They also targeted troops, so unlike a Hog Rider, if you place something too close to them, it could easily get taken out since they dealt a lot of damage, and even though Goblins also targeted troops and moved at a very fast movement speed, they could easily be taken out by a Zap or a Log. Elite Barbarians were uniquely annoying, having the speed, the troop targeting ability, the damage, and the health to withstand most spells. They were difficult to counter efficiently because you had to be so quick and precise with your defense, and Rage would make it even harder to counter. Normally, Elite Barbarians would move at 2 tiles per second, but when enraged, they would move at 2.7 tiles per second. This could be used to catch the defender off guard if they were using rockets, since the rocket's radius was so small. If the E-Barb user could make the defender miss a rocket, they pretty much won the whole game right there. Rage made an already scary strong card even strong and scarier, and it was toxic. Players were furious at this combo. It wasn't too hard to counter if you knew what you were doing and had the right cards, but for most people this wasn't the case. It was a lot easier to play this combo than it was to counter. It was just another example as to why Rage was so unhealthy. It made the more annoying cards even more annoying. People didn't like spawners, people didn't like Elite Barbarians, and those are the cards that benefited the most from Rage. Why would Supercell want to make a card that just makes the game more annoying to play, more prominent? Elite Barbarians were harshly nerfed in January 2017, but even after that, they continued to be used a crazy amount in mid-ladder, and players were crying out continuously for further nerfs. A Rage buff would have only contributed to their toxicity and not been good for the game overall. Sometimes it was just better for a card to be on the weaker side, and that seemed to be the assessment with Rage. But even without any changes, Rage did see a development in competitive play. In January, we saw a Golem Balloon deck begin to trend, and it actually included the Rage. It was mostly used on the balloon, as it could be difficult to get the balloon to connect to the tower, but it did a lot of damage, so using the Rage to help the balloon get just one hit was sometimes worth it. It took a year, but Rage was finally being seen in a top deck. Its usage was still below average, and it was generally weak, but at least it could be viable in the right environment. By the next month though, Rage's use rate fell back down to the 0 to 1% range. Usually I wouldn't have even mentioned a development this small, but considering that was the highest recorded top ladder usage rate of Rage so far, I had to. For the rest of 2017, Rage's use rate in top ladder resided between 0 and 1%, and it received no balance changes the entire year. It was still a fun card to use casually, especially in the new 2v2 mode where more troops were on the field. There didn't seem to be too much demand for a buff, it just seemed destined to remain as a fun card for casuals and not something that would ever see consistent competitive use. Ideally, in a perfect world, all cards would be competitively viable, but some people may argue it's fine if some cards aren't. 2018 through and through was a continuation of this slump. Rage wasn't seeing any spikes, and for the second full year in a row, it received no balance changes. Unless you count being able to be placed on the river as a balance change, but that was a general fix applied to most spells. However, even though there were no obvious statistical spikes, doesn't mean there isn't some notable development to talk about. There was one Rage deck that was somewhat popular from around March through July. It got 20 wins in the 20-win challenge, and you could see it floating around top ladder a bit. This was played like a bait deck. The Elixir Pump was used to bait out big spells, and the Minion Horde and Goblin Gang were to be used when the counter spells were out of cycle. This was good with Rage because a big problem with Rage was that when trying to use it on hordes of fragile units, the opponent would just immediately use a spell to kill them, making the Rage spell effectively a total waste. So if you could bait their spells properly, you didn't have to worry about this. Rage with Sparky was good for a similar reason it was good with Balloon, as just getting one hit out of Sparky could be huge, and with this card specifically, they might try to stun it right when it was about to shoot to reset it, so a Rage could catch them off guard and make them mess up their timing. It was crazy to see a deck like this seeing competitive success. Sparky, Wizard, and Rage were basically a trio of the worst cards in Clash Royale at the time, but somehow players were able to find a way to make them all work together. It was a fun deck to play, and I think players just enjoyed being able to use these cards at a high level, since most of the time you couldn't have success with them in a competitive environment. Rage was still showing signs of potential despite maintaining consistently low use and win rates. As we can see later in the year in October, Rage had one of the lowest use and win rates in Grand Challenges. These were extremely bad rates, indicating Rage was one of the worst cards in the game. In fact, at the time the stat was taken, the only card to have a lower win rate than Rage was, funnily enough, Elite Barbarians. A card that was still overused in mid-ladder despite having some of the worst competitive rates. But we can't just look at Grand Challenge stats in the Rage's case to determine its strength across the game, since it was fundamentally better at max level than in Challenges. A max level Rage spell lasted 2 seconds longer than one at Tournament Standard, which mattered to some extent. It's hard to compare exactly because regardless of where you looked, the use rate was low, and in top ladder, win rate is irrelevant. But really, it was ridiculous that this disparity still remained. It seemed like something that would inevitably need to be fixed. So, in December 2018, Supercell would fix this issue. With Freeze. Freeze, the only other card to have its duration increase with level. This was a card that worked far better at top ladder than in Challenges as well, which made it hard to balance. In Challenges, it felt like it needed a buff, but on top ladder, it felt like it needed a nerf. Supercell explains this issue, and to fix it, they were giving the Freeze a damage stat that would increase with level, and the duration would now be fixed among all levels. All the reasoning that Supercell gave for applying this rework also applied to the Rage spell, so why would they be reworking one but not the other? Well, Freeze was more of an immediate issue, so the team really needed to take some sort of action, unlike Rage, which had been dormant for years. Plus, sometimes with big reworks like this, they like to apply it to one card and wait a little bit before adjusting similar cards that could use similar help. Spawners are the golden example of this. Since Rage affected friendly troops instead of enemy units like Freeze, some players were suggesting reworking it to be sort of like a heal spell, where it would heal units a bit before raging them, and the number of hit points it healed could be increased per level instead of duration. Although since the heal spell had been added as its own card by this point, doing that could have led to problems of them stepping on each other's toes. But regardless, it seemed likely that Rage would get a similar rework to Freeze in the coming months. After 2 full years of no balance changes, help was desperately needed. 2019 could be the Rage's year. 2019 may have been the worst year for Rage yet. Its win rate was somehow still dwindling, at one point officially having the lowest win rate in the game. It was so far below the healthy range that a major buff was in order. The months would go by and balance changes would come, but Rage would be absent from each and every single one of them time and time again. It didn't seem like they had anything planned for Rage after all. It would be the 3rd year in a row it received absolutely no changes. There seemed to be no reason this trend wouldn't continue into 2020, but surprisingly, we did see some more Rage development. This was thanks to 2 new cards released towards the end of 2019, the Elixir Golem and Battle Healer. The Battle Healer and Elixir Golem synergized, and Rage was nice with Elixir Golem since it provided way more than 3 Elixir worth of value up front, so it was essentially automatically a huge positive Elixir trade until it died, so raging it could help take down the tower before the opponent could recoup their Elixir. Battle Healer also synergized well with it because with each hit, it healed nearby units, so more hits meant more healing. This is why you saw a very small but notable spike in February and March of 2020. It was used a little bit since the Battle Healer's release back in December 2019, but this is when we really started to notice a difference. Things would get even crazier in April 2020 because this month, the Heal spell would be transformed into the Heal Spirit. The Heal spell was a card that had been in Clash Royale for a few years but could never quite fit in properly. The team had tested a lot of ideas behind the scenes, but they were never satisfied, which led them to this unprecedented action. In their video talking about it though, they said something very interesting.
We really like this idea of changing spells into spirits, so maybe in the future, who knows, we'll get some more spirits.
They like the idea of turning more spells into spirits. And when they said this, one spell came to everyone's mind. A spell that had struggled to work competitively since day one and whose cost was already very close to the cost of a spirit. A spell that, like the heal, could only affect friendly units. When the community heard this, everybody assumed that Rage would be turned into a spirit next. It was the prime contender for this sort of treatment. It was the only card that didn't level up properly and had also been weak since day one. A Rage Spirit could level up its damage and health per level and finally have a consistent duration. Drew, the community manager, even practically confirmed that they were intending to turn Rage into a spirit shortly after, saying it was a really cool idea and thinking it would be the most natural spell to spirit change. The card had not been forgotten after all. But the Heal Spirit was notable for more than the fact it showcased the likely future for Rage, it actually helped the Rage itself. Elixir Golem Battle Healer decks benefited immensely from the new spirit, and Rage was included a lot with them. We saw another small bump in Rage's Grand Challenge performance thanks to this, and these rates actually weren't bad at all. Elixir Golem was not consistently the most popular, especially after the Battle Healer nerf in May 2020, but throughout the year, Rage was able to consistently maintain around a 3-4% use rate with a win rate in the low 40s, which isn't great, but far better than it's been in previous years. Elixir Golem was yet another toxic card that players did not like being strong, so this was not good PR for the Rage, but it seemed like the spirit rework was inevitable. They even added another spirit in October of that year. The community seemed ready for something like this, as you saw posts and comments suggesting how something like this could work constantly. But the months would go by with no rework or balance changes. Ultimately, 2020 would end up being the 4th consecutive full year with no balance changes to the Rage spell. These reworks can take time, but Drew made it sound like the rework would come within a few months. Despite no changes once again though, Rage had a pretty good year compared to its previous years. It certainly wasn't a joke anymore. It was occasionally being used in top decks and was having some fluctuations in both top ladder and challenges. Maybe Rage didn't need the spirit rework treatment after all. We would see some more Rage developments in 2021. Although its performance was nothing impressive at the beginning of the year, we would see a major spike in early April to rates that indicated it was a balanced card statistically. This was solely thanks to the return of the Elite Barbarians. Elite Barbarians hadn't been seen much in the competitive scene for about 4 years by this point, but on March 31st, 2021, they would receive a huge buff, causing them to spike. Elite Barbarians, an old Rage synergizer, was now being paired with Elixir Golem and Battle Healer, Rage's new synergizers, to create the ultimate toxic deck. Elite Barbarians Rage was not just popular in casual play, but a competitively viable combo now. It wasn't the same since Elite Barbarians' movement speed was decreased, but just the novelty of them being used together was worth bringing up. Elite Barbarians were way stronger than intended, so when they were toned down, we saw Rage's rates fall with it, but E-Barbs were still competitively viable and you would still see the Rage used with them sometimes. Although Rage would technically not receive any balance changes whatsoever in 2021, making it the 5th consecutive full year with no changes, it did sort of receive a buff. You see, on October 27th of that year, Clash Royale would add level 14. This is the first new level they added pretty much ever, at least for all rarities. I would never mention this as a development for any other card because for any other card, this doesn't matter. As I've said, 2 level 1 cards will have the same interaction as the same cards at max level, but since Rage didn't level up properly, adding a new level was a buff that helped the Rage and Rage only. At level 14 or level 9 if you're using the old number system, Rage lasted 10 full seconds, half a second longer than it did at level 13. Fun fact, if you remember, this is the same duration a level 1 Rage had upon launch. This wasn't going to be a game changer, but it's certainly worth noting. If they added more levels in the future, that was just going to lead to Rage being buffed more and more. At level 354, Rage would last a full 3-minute match. They could decrease the Rage's duration, of course, but if Tournament Standard didn't change as well, then that was just going to cause the Tournament Standard Rage to be vastly weaker than a max Rage. Speaking of Tournament Standard though, Rage wasn't only benefited at max level in this update. Also in this patch, champions were added and they started at level 11, so Tournament Standard was raised from level 9 to 11. Meaning at Tournament Standard following this update, Rage would last an extra full second from 7.5 to 8.5 seconds. People do not like extra levels in Clash Royale because it adds a ton of extra grinding for essentially no reason, but Rage was the one and only thing that changed interactions by new levels being added, and this was fundamentally broken. The freeze spell had been changed about 3 years ago by this point to level up consistently, so it's crazy that Rage hadn't gotten similar treatment. It had felt inevitable for years. The team was always making tiny adjustments to cards so the interactions would be consistent across all levels while continuously ignoring the most blatant violation of this rule. We were coming up to the 2-year anniversary since the heal spell became the heal spirit, and players were wondering what happens with the idea of Rage Spirit. The devs seemed excited about the idea, but since then it had been radio silence. Seth, another community manager, talked about this in 2022, confirming there was a plan to transform Rage into the Rage Spirit, but was determined to be much less satisfying. And because there were some fun strategies used in casual play with Rage, they ultimately decided to leave it as is. And honestly, at this point, I don't feel like the card needed any changes. It had a place with Elixir Golem and Goblin Giant Sparky, and its rates weren't too bad. They were below average, but not every card needs to have perfectly statistically balanced rates. Rage was a toxic card that benefited some of the more hated cards, but had to be played carefully to get proper value even though it was only 2 elixir. It wasn't disrupting the meta and could be dealt with. It wasn't even close to the position the heal spell was in. It's very interesting to see a card that has gotten literally no changes for 5 years go from being one of the worst unusable cards in Clash Royale to a competitively viable option. Of course, you can never truly predict how an environment will change over time, but this kind of development for a card that was in such a bad position was very unusual. Things weren't settling here though. In October of that year, the Phoenix and Monk would be released, and they would be game-breakingly strong, so any card that could support them became widely used. You saw some players just mirroring and raging the Phoenixes, and it was also used a lot with the Elixir Golem, which Rage was already a part of. During this brief era of Phoenix domination, Rage hit the highest usage it's ever reached up to this point, being used in more than a quarter of Grand Challenge decks. It was doing what it did best, contributing more toxicity to a toxic meta. It took advantage of Phoenix being too valuable, and even after the emergency nerf, it continued to have higher usage than it's typically had in November. But little did players know at the time that this would essentially be the last hurrah for the old Rage, because in December, it would appear in the balance changes for the first time in over 6 years. From November 2016 up until December 2022, Rage had remained exactly the same. People have been talking about Rage reworks and overhauls for years. It had been 4 years since the Freeze rework and more than 2 since the new spirits were added. Basically, this was long overdue. Despite not causing a major disruption, Supercell ultimately decided that Rage needed a rework. It didn't follow the leveling structure of every other card, and it was finally time to fix that. So they were standardizing Rage's duration to 6 seconds across all levels, a 2.5 second decrease at Tournament Standard and a 4 second decrease at max level. Now, there was actually a scrapped rework that was initially presented and then changed in the final version, so we'll go over what the other stats were initially planned to be first. Rage would now deal damage, which would be the new scaling factor. It just felt kind of wrong that this card would be dealing damage, but there weren't many options if they wanted to fix the leveling system. It was assumed the damage would be really small and not matter much, like the Freeze's damage, but it was actually enough to kill goblins, which even the Zap couldn't do. All of the damage happened right when the spell dropped onto the field, not lingering like the Rage effect did. Its radius was also decreased from 5 to 3 tiles though, so it couldn't cover as much as it used to, but that was still half a tile larger than Zap and Snowball. If that wasn't enough though, it would also deal knockback to small and medium-sized units. However, this would be the smallest amount of knockback any knockback dealing card dealt in Clash Royale at just 3/10 of a tile. For comparison, the log today deals 7/10 of a tile worth of knockback, so this was less than half of that. Although it doesn't seem like this would matter, dealing any knockback at all meant it completely reset cards like Ram Rider and Battle Ram, which was a neat utility. You'll also notice from the preview gameplay that it falls onto the ground like how the Lumberjack drops it instead of just appearing. It makes sense since it would be dealing knockback now, so if it just appeared and knocked back, it would be a bit weird. This was essentially a nerf though because it added a half-second delay before the Rage actually started working. It's good that they adjusted this because this would have clearly been really strong. A card that deals enough damage to kill goblins and hit air units with a radius bigger than the Zap and Giant Snowball that also deals knockback and rages any friendly troop in it for 6 seconds and can also be placed anywhere in the arena with an almost instant deploy for just 2 elixir is insane. These stat adjustments would make the card so much more versatile since it could be used as a defensive spell now or just be quickly cycled on the opponent's tower for some chip damage. Remember, the duration wasn't as important since it lasted a good amount of time, and with proper placement you could mostly get what you needed to get in there anyway. I'm not saying it didn't hurt, it certainly did, but 6 seconds of Rage was still really good, especially for all the damage it was getting. Supercell recognized before implementing this rework that it would probably be too much, so its damage was decreased to match Zap and it would no longer knock back anything. However, that half-second deploy delay would remain, which was a bit odd. Interestingly enough though, this actually was a buff in a way because for this split second while the Rage was deploying, it was occupying the space it was placed on, meaning if your opponent placed something in the same spot as you were placing your Rage, it would become slightly displaced because they couldn't occupy the same space at the same time. This may sound frivolous, but if you used it on a defensive building that was being used to counter your win condition, 1 tile over could be the difference between your troop going towards it and the tower. It was very hard to pull off in an actual match, but if you could do it, it would potentially be a game changer. The rework would finally go live on December 12th, and it was a bit controversial for sure, and it was even questionable whether the card was better or not. Taking a look at its rates, it was statistically balanced, but wasn't that far off from what it was before the rework. a lot of its value came from its damage now, so if you had been primarily using the Rage to boost your giant pushes, you were probably disappointed. Some argued this rework took away from the spell's uniqueness and that it felt too similar to the Zap and Giant Snowball. It was much better against decks with swarms, but worse against decks that didn't. It made the card's value feel almost dependent on what the opponent had versus how your own deck was built, which makes sense since up to this point Rage had no direct effect on enemy units. Some argued this was a good rework though. Consistency fix aside, it was much worse in Goblin Giant Sparky and Elixir Golem and more useful in Cycle decks, which were argued to be healthier and less toxic. Players missed the old Rage, but it seemed to be much better for the game overall to be in the place it was. The rework ultimately seemed to be a major success. Rage wasn't too weak nor too strong, it leveled up consistently, and it was worse in some of its previously most toxic decks. Supercell certainly wasn't going back on this one. Also, this wasn't known at the time, but only about 6 months after this rework was applied, Supercell would add yet another new level, so if Rage hadn't been changed, it would have essentially been buffed again. I'm sure they were well aware of this, which is why they felt it to be necessary to rework it now, because I'm sure level 15 wasn't even the last level they were planning to add. Also, I wanted to mention the fact that in this update, they broke Rage's duration indicator. I know there's at least one longtime Clash Royale player watching this who didn't know that these glowing symbols around the side can be tracked to know how much longer the Rage spell is going to last. When it gets back to the top, that's when you know the Rage spell is about to expire. But after this rework, that wasn't the case. The spell would end when the glowing symbol wasn't even close to the top. They had forgotten to adjust this properly, and it made it harder to know exactly when the spell was going to end. This wouldn't be fixed until January of the next year. 2023 would be the first full year of this newly reworked Rage. It was consistently being used in competitive play, but there wasn't like a super popular Rage deck that you saw it consistently thriving in. But you were still seeing it with Elite Barbarians and occasionally with Goblin Giant Sparky. It seemed to be stable and healthy, and that showed no signs of changing. But in June 2023, things would change immensely as evolutions were introduced into the game. Evolutions brought new mechanics to the game, as well as giving pre-existing cards substantial stat increases, and as we know from Phoenix and Peak Barbs, this was a mechanic destined to benefit from Rage. And right away, we saw Rage appearing with one of the first evolutions. Evolved Royal Giants also play with Rage because when raged, it would be impossible for certain troops like Mini P.E.K.K.A. and Barbarians to deal any damage to it. And this was an important interaction because Barbarians were one of the other cards to get an evolution. Although a lot of Royal Giant decks were using Lumberjack, so there wasn't really a need for Rage in a lot of them. August would be another notable month. This month we would see the Goblin Giant being buffed, and this was good for Rage because as we've seen in the past, they worked pretty well together. Along with the new Knight evolution, we saw Rage thriving. This deck became very popular. Goblin Giant remained as a very popular card, so over the next few months we would see Rage trickling up. In September, we were even seeing Rage make a comeback with the Elixir Golem. These decks that hadn't been seen with Rage much since the rework were once again becoming Rage's best decks, a big part thanks to evolutions. New cards and evolutions were added every month, and it seemed like every single one was being integrated into Goblin Giant decks, leading to higher and higher Rage demand. By November, there were so many popular Goblin Giant decks utilizing all the new troops, and Rage was being used in nearly all of them. By December, it was so popular that it rose to being in more than a quarter of Grand Challenge decks, which is almost as much as the log, about what it was when the Phoenix was introduced. It was looking like this was going to need a harsh nerf, since Supercell does not like it when cards are being used more than the log. But this sudden rise had nothing to do with Rage suddenly becoming OP. It was just really good support to the Goblin Giant, which was really strong. When Goblin Giant was nerfed in December, we quickly saw Rage's usage drop by double digits. It was in a much more appropriate range, almost perfectly average in fact. And spells generally have higher usage rates anyway, but despite it cooling off, Supercell would decide to nerf it in January 2024. In this set, its duration would be decreased from 6 to 5.5 seconds. They explain that the Rage spell currently meshes seamlessly with many popular meta cards and that they were aiming to reduce its impact by decreasing its duration in all those combinations. It's a fairly light nerf, but you could argue it didn't need a nerf at all. I mean, just comparing its usage to every other small spell taken from the day before the nerf going live, Rage was the least used of them. Its usage was just about average. It was the other small spells that were technically overused. It did have a very high amount of usage for a few months in 2023, but that was almost solely because of the Goblin Giant. Luckily though, this nerf didn't seem to make any difference whatsoever. It was still in a great position, maintaining a healthy performance, appearing in lots of different decks after the change went live. We even saw another major rise the following month with the addition of the second evolution slot. With even more stronger units running around, there was a higher demand for Rage. Goblin Giant Sparky and Elixir Golem benefited a lot from this extra slot, and the Rage had unique benefits for a lot of these evolutions I have yet to mention. Like, the Rage could help evolved skeletons multiply faster, or the evolved bats heal quicker. It was useful for much more than to just help troops deal more damage in a shorter time frame. As evolutions became more prominent, the Rage did as well. It was seeming like it was going to need another nerf, but there would be another major shift in March. The Goblin Giant would receive yet another nerf this month, and we also saw the introduction of the evolved Zap, which was very powerful, which led to it almost instantly boxing out the other small spells. With these developments, Rage's usage dropped to the lowest it's been since before it got reworked all the way back in 2022. It was quite the fluctuation. Instead of riding the popularity of overpowered cards, it was being overshadowed by different overpowered cards. But things seemed to balance out after the evolved Zap got nerfed in May, and you once again saw Rage integrated into new meta decks with the new evolved Wizard and Void spell. Although the first few months of 2024 seemed to be relatively tame, things were about to get crazy for the second half. Now, I know I keep mentioning these brief periods that only last a few days, and usually I wouldn't keep bringing them up, but I feel this one is especially worth noting just because this marks the Rage spell's all-time high of usage. On June 17th, Clash Royale would release some brand new cards that completely warped the meta. Like with the Phoenix, mirroring and raging the Goblin Machine became the best strategy. Despite the Goblin Curse, another 2 elixir spell that was very strong also being added, there was an extremely high demand for Rage. Goblin Machine synergized well with the Rage, not just because it was grossly overpowered, but also partly because it had a secondary attack just like the Goblin Giant. During this brief 2-day period, Rage's use rate reached nearly 60% in Grand Challenges. Every single top Rage deck included the Goblin Machine. It was a must-have. After the inevitable nerfs, the rates once again settled to about what they were before the June update, and that seemed to be about where it would remain, but things kept developing. In July, we saw the introduction of the Goblin Giant evolution, which would now spawn units periodically once it was at half health or lower. This made Rage the perfect synergizer because not only did this card have a secondary attack, but also a spawn speed stat now. And you have to remember, the Rage will also boost the units the Giant spawns, so just boosting this one troop was like boosting an entire push. From this point, Goblin Giant depended on Rage like the Executioner used to rely on Tornado. This double Prince deck, for example, blew up in August. Even though this deck had 2 other small spells already, Rage provided so much value to the Goblin Giant. Evolved Goblin Giant was so good when raged, it was worth building the entire deck around clearing a path for it. And this was just the start of it. The month after that, the evolved P.E.K.K.A. would be added, and you saw that being paired with the evolved Goblin Giant a lot as well. You were also beginning to see a lot of Ram Rider paired with Rage. That card was generally strong, and it could be really obnoxious when raged because it moved at a very fast movement speed. Not to mention, it also had a secondary attack. It was especially seeing a lot of use with the new Goblinstein in October. Thanks to all of these developments, Rage was used in a solid 1/5 of all Grand Challenge decks. It fell a little bit in November following Ram Rider, Goblinstein, and evolved P.E.K.K.A. nerfs, but it was still higher than average. And in December, we would get the Royal Chef Tower troop, which helped make those evolved P.E.K.K.A. Goblin Giant decks thrive even more, so it was still maintaining above 20% usage by the end of 2024. Despite the seemingly unnecessary nerf it got in January, it was proving to be a top-tier card. And you could still argue it was only overused because of other prominent cards and evolutions, but the fact of the matter was, there was never going to be a perfectly balanced meta. There's always going to be cards stronger than they should be, especially when they're adding new evolutions every month. This was similar to the problem the Mirror had in 2022. On its own, it was okay, but when there was a strong card in the meta, Mirror was overused with said card, which is why it was nerfed into oblivion. They nerfed Rage for a lot less in January, so it was surprising to see them leave it alone now, despite it being in a much better place than it was before it was nerfed. And the developments were far from over. 2025 would be just as, if not crazier for Rage than 2024. Some of these developments were so crazy, it personally shocked me how Supercell let it slide. It's pretty much what inspired me to make this video, so without any further ado, let's get into it. Despite 24 cards receiving balance changes in the January 2025 balance changes and its usage consistently above 20%, Rage managed to avoid the nerf hammer. There would be one major development for Rage for the first 4 months of the year, and the first 2 probably made the team regret not nerfing it sooner. The January development would come thanks to a new card, the Rune Giant. The Rune Giant was not very good at first, but on January 21st, they would give it a huge buff which made it widely used. This card benefited the Goblin Giant immensely for essentially the same reason the Rage benefited it, so you were seeing a lot more Goblin Giant again. Combined with the Royal Chef, these four made for an unstoppable group. Everything boosted the Goblin Giants so well that they all had spikes in their usage, and the Rage's usage was on the higher end, reaching nearly 50%. Not quite its peak of all time, but it was close. This period lasted for 9 days before Rune Giant was emergency nerfed. But just 4 days after that, they would give the Rage spell a brand new ability. We've talked about Rage benefiting evolutions disproportionately, but that was nothing compared to the evolution that would be released in February. On February 3rd, the Lumberjack evolution would be released, and the gimmick here was that upon death, a Lumberjack ghost would spawn in the Rage it dropped and continue to attack until the Rage went away or it walked out of range. But the Lumberjack ghost didn't need to be in the Lumberjack's Rage to survive, it could survive as long as it was raged at all. Meaning, you could actually extend the life of it by putting a Rage spell where the ghost was or was going, which is quite literally a brand new ability. It inherently made the Rage and Lumberjack insanely good synergizers. You never saw Lumberjack and Rage in the same deck before because they had served similar functions since they both had a Rage effect. But now that Rage had a unique benefit to the Lumberjack, they were inseparable. Also, just to note, the Lumberjack Ghost was invincible as long as there was a Rage spell down, so there was no worry about it getting spelled away or countered easily. It was pretty much a guaranteed 5.5 second extension of the Lumberjack Ghost's life, which allowed for 6 extra hits. That was enough to fully take out an Archer Queen. Some players even used the Mirror and other quick cycle cards to keep cycling to more Rages to keep the Lumberjack Ghost alive for as long as possible. And again, there was no way to kill it unless you could get it out of that Rage. All you could really do as a defender is put down troops to absorb damage, to prevent it from destroying your towers, but most troops weren't worth using as an absorber. Evolved Lumberjack and Raged was a game-breaking combo, so only 8 days after the Evolved Lumberjack was introduced, the Rage spell lost its ability to extend the lifetime of the Lumberjack Ghost. They no longer had a unique synergy. This seems to hurt the Rage spell more than the Evolved Lumberjack though, because Evolved Lumberjack was still very strong even without the Rage's support, and with it still so prevalent, it filled the Rage role for many decks. Rage ended up only finishing in 9 of the top 100 decks for the February season, which is the lowest it's been for a while. I specifically opted to use top ladder rates here because Evolved Lumberjack wasn't available in Grand Challenges yet. Despite the card performing worse than usual though, Supercell would give the Rage a nerf in March. In this set, the Rage duration of troops that left the pool would be decreased from 2 to 1 second. It had been 9 years since this stat was changed, so why now? Well, Rage may not have had high usage at the moment, but that doesn't mean it was weak. It was simply overshadowed by the way too strong Evolved Lumberjack. This change was aimed more towards the Evolved Lumberjack anyway. With this change, the Lumberjack Ghost would disappear 1 second earlier when stepping out of the Rage, a much needed nerf to that unit. The following month, Evolved Lumberjack was still by far the most used evolution though, but the Rage spell actually saw a rise in usage. That was because of this trending Giant Prince deck that Rage was being used in. It was a bit shocking to see a deck like this still trending despite the synergy between Lumberjack and Rage being vastly diminished. And besides this, you still saw plenty of Rage with Goblin Giant, Royal Giant, and Elixir Golem. If you added up the usage of both variants of the Lumberjack along with Rage, it totaled to 50%. It was so dominant that Supercell once again brought down the nerf hammer in April. In this set, the Rage's damage was decreased by 23%. It could still kill everything it could kill before, but one small interaction difference I found was that now when used on a Dark Goblin, it would take 2 tower shots to finish off instead of 1. But I think the bigger thing to note is how it would be less efficient to cycle on towers for chip damage. Even though Rage's primary purpose has never been cycling for direct tower damage, it's worth pointing out the impact it had since it was decreased by such a large percentage. It makes a big difference in tight battles. I think this change was the right decision. The freeze spell does a very small amount of damage, and I think that's how it should be for those types of spells. The focus of those cards should be their abilities. The damage really should just be more of a formality. Personally, I might even go as far as to nerf Rage so it couldn't even kill Spear Goblins anymore. We have so many small spells that there needs to be separation between them. That's the last balance change Rage has received to date, so that pretty much brings us to today. There's not really anything huge to note since this last balance change. Rage has still had an above average use and win rate appearing in the same types of decks it's been appearing in for years now. Even though it's still used a solid amount, for the standards of a spell, it's still relatively low. But it's not exactly the funnest card to play against, so I'm certainly not advocating for a buff. The Rage has come a long way since its original implementation. from an inconsistent, broken mess to a coherent and relatively healthy card. It hasn't received that many balance changes over the years, yet I feel like it's had so many developments and fluctuations. A few years ago, I would always compare it to Clone or Mirror, a gimmick card that isn't competitively viable but fun to play in a casual setting sometimes. But even before it got that rework, it was finding a place and seeing development, and Supercell has been giving it tweaks and allowing it to stay strong. Unlike Mirror and Clone, which are still some of the worst cards in the game and have received no changes in years, for a gimmick card, it's done really well for itself, although I still do miss the old Rage personally. I'm honestly a little surprised it's not more hated. Years ago, I never thought this card would consistently be a top spell. It is yet to receive its own evolution as of this video, and I'm very curious to see what that looks like. I think the devs are going to need to be careful because I think a Rage evolution has a lot of potential of being very, very toxic, and I don't want to see the card ruined with one. But let me know what you think about Rage. Do you like how it is today, or does it need a nerf? Also let me know which card's history you would like to see next. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you later.